So taxpayers are simulating, and in reality, either nothing truly happened or something different happened. And in the sham approach, the look is taken through the simulation to what's really done. So that's, again, either nothing, simply whatever the taxpayer did can be fully disregarded, or the true transaction, the underlying transaction, is taken into account for tax purposes. If we move to the substance over form approach, we enter into a principally different area. Here, the legal transaction, the legal nature of the transaction is fully recognized. But it isn't followed for tax purposes. For tax purposes, the existing, the recognized, the not disregarded legal transaction is simply replaced by the underlying economic reality, the underlying economic substance of the transaction. Substance over form is also an approach which is used by great many countries. Let's move now to the third approach, which in many European countries has the Latin name fraus legis, or abuse of law. It's typically a continental European approach. Here again, the legal transaction, the legal construction is not disregarded. It is recognized as being a true, a valid legal construction, but it is replaced, it's substituted by another one that the taxpayer tried to avoid, because the transaction that he shows has more advantageous consequence for the taxpayer than the one that is being hidden. So again, in this approach, you replace a valid legal transaction by another one for tax purposes. The fourth approach I mention here is the recharacterization of the facts. Of course, the facts as they take place cannot be denied as such, but the facts as they take place are not taken as the basis for the tax consequences. If you have to go from A to B, and there's a highway from A to B which is 20 kilometers long, and rather than taking the highway, you take all the secondary roads, it's going to take you much longer, and the total length may be increased from 20 kilometers to 80 kilometers. Then if you sort of transfer this to recharacterization of facts, if the taxpayer has decided to take the long 80 kilometer road because he may avoid a toll levy, under this particular approach, you simply deny that the 80 kilometers are going to be relevant, and you replace the 80 kilometers by the straight road of 20 kilometers, and you base the taxation on the assumption that the taxpayer in reality would have taken the shorter road. In addition to, or in place of, these regimes I just mentioned, countries may have a GAR regime, a general anti-avoidance rule. And although these rules vary to quite some extent among countries, usually there are two common elements that can be discerned from the requirements that countries apply in this rule. The first is that the transaction, or a complex of transactions, is set up with the predominant aim to avoid tax. And if one would follow the transaction or complex of transactions as set up by the taxpayer, it's obvious that the object and purpose of the tax law will be frustrated. So these are the two common elements that countries usually apply when they draft a general anti-avoidance rule approach. Increasingly, you see countries that traditionally had very little or almost nothing in their books regarding anti-avoidance rules. Increasingly, you see in Europe now countries looking into the possibility of introducing such a rule. Of course, the enormous disadvantage of such a broadly drafted rule is that it creates an enormous level of uncertainty for the taxpayers. It requires an enormous amount of cases, case law to develop by the local courts in order to indicate how this approach works out in a whole range of different scenarios. So it's going to take many years before taxpayers will be aware of how this very general rule needs to be translated into particular rules for particular transactions. It also requires a judiciary that is well educated in tax law, a judiciary that's also familiar with how business may work in particular settings, and particularly in cross-border settings. So again, it's a rule that is increasingly embraced by many countries, but it's at the same time a rule that has, I would say, particular drawbacks, but particular characteristics that makes it necessary that countries should not easily decide to include such a rule in their statute. Something that was virtually absent in the tax law of most countries is what you see today developing fairly quickly. Many countries, as soon as they see a particular pattern develop, are fairly quick in reacting through legislative action by enacting a rule that in a very focused way deals with a very particular type of perceived abuse. And what I've listed here are 4 examples of what countries sometimes do. And they all fall under the category imputed income. Imputed income means the taxpayer will be taxed for income that he did not really earn. He is simply assumed to have earned particular income, and he's going to be taxed on that income that he assumedly earned. Well, let's take a look at these 3 categories.